Who won the David Jiricek trade, and what is Jiricek's overall upside? All that and a lot more on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this show, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. My name is Sebastian High. I'm the USHL and crossover scout over at Elite Prospects, typically joined by Hattie Kalakesh, the QMJHL and crossover scout at Elite Prospects. And we have a very exciting episode here for you today, though it's just going to be me, I believe, for the entire week because our poor friend is out with illness at the moment. It is that season of the year. But today we'll be looking at the David Jiricek trade, which is, of course, the big news of the weekend. Who won it? What Jiricek's overall upside is? What Minnesota can really expect from this player both this season and beyond. And in the final segment, we'll be looking at the two players leading the line in the Calder race, being Macklin Celebrini and Matvei Michkov, who have both been fantastic to start their rookie campaigns. But before we get into all that, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So a lot of exciting stuff here going on. Let's first break down what the actual trade was, because it is big news. This is a player that was drafted 6th overall just 2 years ago in that 2022 NHL draft. And he was a player that both me and Hattie have loved going back to his draft year, even though he is a bit divisive because there's a level of inconsistency in his game. We'll dive more into that in the second segment. But to break down the trade first and foremost here, the Minnesota Wild acquired David Jiricek and a 2025 fifth-round draft selection from the Columbus Blue Jackets in exchange for left shot defenseman Damon Hunt, who is in the final year of his entry-level contract, a 2025 first-round draft selection, which is top 5 protected, which I don't think will be any kind of issue for the Minnesota Wild this season, especially with the league's leading scorer, Kirill Kaprizov, in their books. They also acquired a 2026 third-round draft selection, which was originally that of the Colorado Avalanche, so probably a late third-round pick in 2026. Same can be said about a fourth-round draft selection in 2026, which they acquired, which originally belonged to the Toronto Maple Leafs. And Columbus also acquires Minnesota Wild's own 2027 second-round selection. So overall, the deal is a first, a second, a third, and a fourth, plus Damon Hunt for David Jiricek and a fifth-round draft selection. So we've got a whole descending order of quality of draft picks, one per round being used. And of course, Jiricek and Damon Hunt being the two drafted players being dealt in this trade. And overall, I think that this is really good business for the Minnesota Wild specifically. We'll dive into why later on in the segment. And that said, I do think that Columbus made the best out of a poor situation that I think wasn't handled as well as it maybe could have been, because David Jiricek is a really dynamic blue line prospect. This is not the most refined player, and that was the same in his draft year. Like, it was him and Simon Nemec as like the two top end defensemen of that draft class during the draft cycle. Of course, the same draft class that also had guys like Denton Mateychuk and Pavel Mintyukov and Lane Hudson and Seamus Casey. A lot of quality on the blue line in that 2022 NHL draft. But Jiricek and Nemec were really the top two the entire year long. They were going to be the first two defensemen selected. And they were, and that was never going to really change. They were the two blue chip blue line prospects heading into that draft year. And ever since then, Jiricek has kept developing, but has remained quite raw. And yeah, as I mentioned in his draft year with Nemec has always been the more refined and polished and consistent and reliable player. whereas Jiricek has the skill to just break games open, but can also leave a lot of space behind him. And one big element that was also noted by fellow elite prospect scout David Jiricek in an excellent breakdown article that came out the day before the trade was actually finalized, breaking down which teams would be good fits for Jiricek, what he needs in his development. A really key component with Jiricek is he has to work on the skating skill. And I think that Minnesota is a really good landing spot for him for that specifically. We've seen their players come into the league and really take a step or two in the skating department. And with Jiricek, it's especially the pivots. When he commits his weight in one direction, getting back the other way is pretty slow. It's a bit sloggy. And it means that players can get around him. And if they get around him, he's out of the play more often than not, which is certainly something that Columbus coaching staff did not much appreciate it, which certainly led to Jiricek being benched for most of the season so far. I mean, this player, he played 6 NHL games this season after he suited up for 43 last year. And in those games, his highest time on ice was 17 minutes. His second highest time on ice was 12 and a half minutes. And half the games of those 6, he played less than 10. So he was very much not utilized this season. He sat in the press box for a really good chunk of the early year before being sent down to the Cleveland Monsters for 4 games to kind of showcase him prior to the trade. In those 6 NHL games, he's allowed 1 assist, and in the 4 AHL games, he scored 2 goals, including an OT winner, I believe, and added an assist for 3 points. But Jiricek's a very interesting player, but I think the Minnesota Wild are a fantastic landing spot for him because on the one hand, they needed right shot defensemen. They, of course, already have Brock Faber, which I think is fantastic because it limits the weight on Jiricek's shoulders to be the number 1 right D in the organization, which had been the case in Columbus when he was drafted there, and of course has kind of shifted since then with the Blue Jackets organization. But with Brock Faber ahead of him, a really stable, intelligent, defensively elite young right shot defenseman, Jiricek has an excellent foil in that lineup in the depth chart where Jiricek is a lot more dynamic. He's a lot more creative. He's a fantastic puck handler. He has a wicked shot from the blue line, and he comes up with ideas that very few NHL defensemen do. He can solve complex situations in really interesting ways and is certainly a very different kind of weapon from the blue line than Brock Faber is. And especially considering that players like Jonas Brodin are already in this NHL lineup for the Minnesota Wild, I think that there's already a couple of pieces that are perfect to insulate Jiricek with this organization because he will need to be insulated. That said, let's focus on the Columbus side here because let's talk about the mismanagement of assets a little bit here. I think that David Jiricek could have gotten a much bigger return if he hadn't been sent up to the press box for the entire start of the season, if they dealt him in the offseason, for instance, instead, or if they just played him like 19 minutes a night for these first 20 games of the season. And I mean, Columbus is not a contending team. I think they certainly could have afforded that risk and the calculated risk that is playing a lot of minutes with David Jiricek on the ice because there's always some defensive drawbacks at times. Even though he is quite physical, he can shut down play really well. But as I said, if you get around him, he struggles to get back into the play afterwards. But I still think that given the situation, given the fact that they probably could have gotten more in the offseason than they did here, I think they did quite well. A first-round draft selection is a good asset. It's not going to be an early one, and this year's draft isn't the strongest in the late first range. There's a lot of B-level prospects that are going to be there rather than like pure A-level guys. And I mean, last year he probably had 25 to 27 A-level prospects that were like really clear first rounders in my eyes. This year is probably closer to 21 or 22. So once you get past a certain point of the draft, there's going to be fewer and fewer of those high-end prospects available. We'll see how that draft pick turns out. That said, Columbus drafts well. I've always really liked their drafting in recent seasons. I mean, whether it be Caden Lindstrom or going back to the year before that, I mean, Adam Fantilli was a great selection, obviously number 3, but most teams would have made that pick. But even getting a guy like Gavin Brindley in the early second round was fantastic value. So don't write off this first round pick. I'm sure they'll get a really good asset. The question is it going to be a middle six or top six level player if it's a forward, right? Is it going to be that kind of caliber? Or is it going to be a bit more of like a slightly more of a depth or complementary piece going the other way? A second and a third, solid. You always want to get those picks in, especially when you're rebuilding like Columbus is, and they draft well. I mean, maybe it would have been nice if that second round pick had been a little bit earlier than 2027, because it's just a long wait until that prospect is going to be anywhere close to the NHL. And Damon Hunt is a pretty solid player. He's a player that was drafted 65th overall in 2020. So he's 2 years older than David Jiricek. He's a 6'1", 201-pound left shot defenseman, and he's very solid. Like this season, he's already been assistant captain with the Iowa Wild. It's been his the fourth season where he's played games in the AHL. So very a pretty polished young player who's played a lot of professional hockey already. He was also captain of the Moose Jaw Warriors for 2 seasons. In 2020, 2021. And yeah, as I mentioned, he's already been an assistant captain in the AHL. He scored 4 assists in 9 games in the AHL this season. Last year in the AHL, he scored 3 goals and 29 points in 51 games. This is overall a mobile two-way defenseman who's a really solid and effortless skater, and overall some decent defensive habits, whether it be closing his gaps very early, keeping really good like matching footwork very well off the rush to maintain his gap, and he's a lot better at catching up to play when it gets around him. So on the defensive side of things, he's probably more solid at this point than David Jiricek is. So don't be shocked if he plays some NHL minutes this season with Columbus, but the upside's a little bit more limited. Maybe tops that as a number 4 guy. I think it's more of a bottom pairing puck mover kind of situation who can fill in up the lineup in case of injuries and who's going to be a really good presence in the locker room, but not a game changer as is. So that first round selection really is the one big shot that Columbus has at acquiring a game changing piece in this trade. But in the next segment, we're going to really dive deeper into David Jiricek, what makes him special, why Minnesota went out to trade for this player, and what other teams maybe have missed out on and not paying a little bit more to acquire him. But first, a quick word from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need all in one place to place live bets on the NFL. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you place your bets. Whether you want to take your swings on the NFL or perhaps you prefer European football, like the Champions League is now going in full force, and all the big leagues are in full-blown title races at this point already. Or perhaps you prefer tennis or golf, or if you're listening to this podcast, perhaps hockey is your sport of choice. Whatever it may be, FanDuel has something for every kind of sports fan. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That is at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Game Time is the best option to get cheap tickets right before your events start. Whether it be a sporting event or a comedy show or a theater play, whatever it may be, whatever interests you in terms of events, when you have an afternoon free, as I often do with my flexible schedule, Game Time is the place I love to go to see what I can fill my time with. They always have awesome deals on game day in order to save you money, and also have other ways of saving money. For instance, you can select the section and Game Time selects the seat for you for an extra discount. And Game Time has a brand new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands and thousands of tickets. One of my favorite game time features are the seat views. They give you panoramic views of any seat that you want to buy, so you can make sure that there isn't a massive pillar in the way, that your sightlines are good, and that you're not going to arrive at your event being very disappointed. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Alrighty, let's keep this episode rolling here by zeroing in a little bit on David Jiricek. He is a really intriguing right shot defenseman at 6'3", 209 pounds. He was selected at 6th overall, as I mentioned in the first segment, by the Columbus Blue Jackets. And he's a player that in the defensive zone applies really effective pressure. I've always really liked how he closes his gaps. He plays aggressively. He takes his defensive risks. He's not one to hold himself back in any way, but he also takes those risks and misses at times, which is the drawback with Jiricek. You're going to have to take some of the bad in order to also have access to the good. With Jiricek, there's definitely still a lot of room to evolve with this player. He still has a lot of runway for a prospect that was drafted 6th overall just 2.5 years ago. He's not one of these players that hits their ceiling at an early point in their careers. I think that Jiricek's going to keep getting better and better and better until he's 26, 27 years old, that he still has like 5 or so years of ascension in his development, because the flashes are fantastic. The consistency is a little bit of the issue, but a lot of what he does so well comes either in terms of the defensive aggression or his on-puck play. He's a really dynamic player. He's so creative. He's able to create high-end offensive situation. He can go end-to-end, really deceptive with the puck on his stick. Not to say that he's going to be a Lane Hudson or Quinn Hughes or anything along those lines of like deceptive blue liners, but in terms of that 6'3" frame, over 200 pounds, he is quite deceptive in his movements. He can get around forecheckers quite effectively. He's a solid breakout passer in the offensive zone. He can activate up very comfortably, and I've seen him activate up to the hash mark, cut inside, get a high danger shot off. This is a player that likes to create when he's on the ice, and certainly has been able to do that at the AHL level. He's done fantastically in the AHL for the Cleveland Monsters. I mean, last season he played 29 games there. He scored 7 goals and 19 points. Fantastic production from the blue line in the AHL. And this is also a player that I think it's important to note hasn't really had much time to dominate a league, going back to his D-1 season, probably, maybe even actually D-2 season, when he was splitting his year between the U20 and the U17 levels in Czechia, because in his draft -1 and his draft year, he's playing pro hockey in Czechia with HC Pilsen in the top pro league. And then he came directly over to North America to play in the NHL and AHL. I mean, he scored 38 points in 55 games in his rookie season after being drafted in the AHL as well. And he's just been playing pro hockey ever since. So this isn't a player that's been really put into a situation to learn to dominate, but he's done the best that he's been able to at the AHL level, being really impactful, though perhaps not quite at the dominant level of the league on the blue line. Even though the offensive numbers are fantastic, there still are those defensive miscues. And there's a reason that Columbus was hesitant to give him minutes, even though I think in terms of long-term value, it would have been very wise to give him a better shot in the NHL with more consistent minutes and a more consistent like pairing mate, which I do believe he will be getting in Minnesota. This is one of the things I love about the Minnesota Wild. They develop their prospects not just well, but very intelligently and strategically. I think that Jonas Brodin would be a fantastic player to staple Jiricek to for this season especially, and just kind of get grounded and have a player beside him that can sweep things up when he makes a mistake, where there isn't pressure on him to play a mistake-free game, because if you pressure Jiricek to play mistake-free, you're not going to get very good hockey out of him. He's going to clutch hard on his stick. You're going to lose a lot of that creativity that makes him special. And That said, this isn't a player who's a slam dunk to be a top pairing or top 3 defenseman in the NHL just yet. There is certainly some risk associated to this trade for Minnesota, but I think it is well worth it. On the one hand, Minnesota has a stacked prospect pool. Like, that first round pick, I think, was a bit expendable. They want to contend now. Jiricek's a lot closer to playing now than that first round pick will be. And Damon Hunt is one of a myriad of left shot defenders that are quite solid in Minnesota's system. But the right side of defense has been a lot weaker. Apart from Brock Faber, there really aren't any other players in the system that project in a top 4 capacity down the right side. So Jiricek fills a really important hole and will also thus get the opportunities to develop and get the chances that he needs, because he wasn't really getting those in Columbus this season. So I think that he's a fantastic fit for Minnesota. I think that they did a really good job with this deal. I'd say that Minnesota won the trade overall, though I think that Columbus did well considering the situation here. I think Don Waddell got a decent enough haul for this player. It's not like an overly disappointing trade for them, but I think that's more the circumstances that led to the trade that are perhaps a bit more disappointing to Blue Jackets fans in particular. But I'd say for the Minnesota Wild, I'd give this an A- grade. This is a really hard home run swing. There is certainly some risk associated, but what they sent Columbus's way is certainly expendable with what they have in their system already. And I think that Jiricek is a player that will thrive in Minnesota specifically. I think it's a great landing spot for him. I think that he's a great player to be landing in Minnesota for the team. I think it's just a really good fit on both sides. As for Columbus, I'd give the return a B- grade. I think they did okay given the situation. First round pick, always like to have that in your back pocket. They use their first round picks quite well. So I'm hopeful that they'll get a really solid prospect with that selection. Damon Hunt is a solid piece to just have in your cupboard, but there's a lot of players like kind of in that mold in Columbus, like Jordan Harris is there. You have a lot of players that are perhaps not the biggest, not the most physical, but good puck moving guys that are left shots that are projected as number 5-ish like range of players on the blue line. So there's a little bit of, I think they could have perhaps targeted a player where there wasn't already such a logjam, like in their overall depth chart, especially among younger players that play this kind of style. But still, I think it's a decent enough return for Columbus. And overall, a fascinating trade. We don't see these massive prospect trades all that often where it's a big blue chip prospect for a haul of draft picks, but this was a really interesting one, a pretty long trade debacle going up to it. I was curious to see where he's going to end up landing, and Minnesota was my number 1 destination for him as well. So I think it's overall a great fit. In the next segment, we'll be taking a look at Macklin Celebrini and Matvei Michkov, who are both in the lead of the Calder race so far this season. But first, a quick word from our sponsors here over at Prize Picks. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long with PrizePicks. PrizePicks invented the flex play, which means that you can still cash out your lineup even if it isn't perfect. You can double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. PrizePicks puts their members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When my picks hit, I can get my money in as quick as 15 minutes. Sign up today to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive that $50 bonus. It is guaranteed. If you think that Connor McDavid can score more than 1.5 goals next week, Austin Matthews even more than that, you can cook up hot takes with your friends all week long and win real money this hockey season when you and your crew run your game on PrizePicks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That is code LOCKEDONNHL. PrizePicks, run your game. All right, let's wrap up the show here by talking about the 2 big rookies in the NHL this season. First, we have Macklin Celebrini of the San Jose Sharks. And of course, we also have Matvei Michkov, the overtime goal scorer galore of the Philadelphia Flyers. So these are 2 players that I've loved scouting in their respective draft years. These are both players that ended up very high on my draft boards. Of course, Celebrini was my number one, my number one ranking in 2024, which I believe was the same for about every single scout on the planet. And the year before that, Michkov was at number 3 on my board, and I thought that he was beyond fantastic value at 7th overall for the Philadelphia Flyers. Celebrini has been utterly fantastic for the Sharks since he's returned from injury. He has really been leading the charge offensively, but I mean, in transition, he's been fantastic. In 15 games this season with San Jose, he's already scored 8 goals and 14 points. And remember, he had a pretty big injury right in the midst of that, but he's been elite for the San Jose Sharks. This is a player that I love watching. The level of maturity in his game, he already looks like a 24-year-old NHL player rather than an 18-year-old. He, I believe, leads the league in in end-to-end rushes per 60 so far this season, and even in overall end-to-end rushes, he's like relatively near the top despite having missed over 10 games this year already. This is a very, very dynamic puck carrier. He attacks with speed, he attacks with deception and high-end intelligence. He can find gaps very easily, even at the NHL level, to get the puck into the offensive zone. He's a high-end puck handler. He's constantly shifting backhand, forehand, layering in some shoulder fakes, some head fakes, making defenders bite as soon as they commit their weight in one direction. He pops out the other. And overall, I think he learned a little bit from Lane Hudson, perhaps, with that specific technique in his season at Boston University last year. But for San Jose, Celebrini is looking exactly like what they drafted him to be, which is the franchise centerman. He's already the best player on the team from what I've seen so far this season. I haven't watched a game where he hasn't been the best player for San Jose when he's been playing. I mean, Mikael Granlund's been excellent so far this season, of course, too, but Celebrini is a real game changer. And I mean, Will Smith is acclimating slowly to the NHL, but you can really see the gap in maturity between those two players, which was also evident in college last year. Even though Smith scored more points, Celebrini was always a lot more polished, a lot more refined, much more of a 200-foot player. And I mean, the defensive impact with Celebrini has already been very good. The fact that he's only a -2 while playing 20 minutes a night for the San Jose Sharks this season, I think, is worthy of a medal. That is quite impressive. And overall, Celebrini has just been fantastic. He's been as advertised, and he was advertised to a very high degree going into the season for the San Jose Sharks. So I think that they'll be more than happy with their player. He is the cornerstone of the franchise now, and he is playing like it as an 18-year-old. And just a reminder, this player turned 18 on June 13th of this year. This is a very young player. He's the youngest player in the entire NHL this season, and he certainly does not look like the youngest player in the NHL. So it's been a fantastic start to his rookie campaign so far in San Jose. Then Matvei Michkov of the Philadelphia Flyers, a player that is just so much fun to watch. When you want offense, when you want some chaos, he's exactly what you want to see. Of course, the defensive limitations are still there. He's never going to win a Selfie Award, but that's not what he was drafted to do. And what he's doing and what he was drafted to do is scoring goals, and many of them. He's been really, really good for Philadelphia this season. 9 goals and 19 points in 23 games for the Flyers. And I mean, at one point this season, he's already been benched for a couple games, and yet he is second on the team in points behind Travis Konechny, who has 30 in 25 games this season. He's been fantastic for the Flyers. But beyond that, Michkov is 4 ahead of the third place scorer, which is Travis Sanheim. So he's already really putting some distance between himself and the pack in Philadelphia in terms of offensive production and offensive dynamism, really, is what he brings. He's such a high-end puck handler. He's so intelligent. And you see that on his on his overtime winners as well. I believe at least 2 of them came on breakaways. Certainly plays where he may have cherry-picked slightly and not committed defensively in order to be a breakout option. But in overtime, you kind of want to do that. I'll be honest, if you had Matvei Michkov just in a pure defensive position at this point in his career, he wouldn't play that nearly as effectively as he does as a cherry picker. At times, I'm not calling him that stylistically, but there's just some flashes of that still in his game. But he's scored those winners, and on those OT winners, there's so much composure, there's so much intelligence. He can make goaltenders bite. more easily than most NHL snipers can on breakaways already. So he's a player that I think that Philadelphia Flyers fans are going to appreciate for a very, very long time, and a player that is acclimating really, really well to the NHL. In his last 10 games, he's been playing more minutes. He's been playing between 14 and 19 a night, typically playing either 14 or 19 a night. So certainly a bit staggered in his ice time, which I don't think is a bad thing. Trying to insulate him some games, give him a lot more ice time than others, depending on the opponent too. But overall, Michkov is a dynamic offensive talent who's scoring goals. He's creating as well offensively with his playmaking ability, which has been underrated his entire lifetime as a prospect. I mean, the goal scoring is flashier perhaps, but the playmaking is perhaps maybe the better tool at the NHL level. But we'll see how that keeps developing for Matvei Michkov. But who do you think is going to win the Calder between these two players? Or is it going to be Lane Hutson? Is he going to be in the mix here at the end of the season as well? There's a lot of really high-end candidates for the Calder this season. Definitely some fun debates to be had. I think that Celebrini is probably my favorite this season, which isn't the hottest of takes, but he's just been so good in every facet of the game. Guys like Hutson and Michkov have been fantastic, but it's still quite clear that there are still some holes in their games. With Celebrini, it is basically flawless in terms of like a lack of big mistakes being made and just the habits that are already there, and the fact that he looks like a 24-year-old at the young age of 18 on the ice. So yeah, it's been a very fun season to keep track of the Calder race. I'm sure that will continue being the case here. But that wraps things up for the show today. Please, if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make us your first listen of the day. We always appreciate our everydayers. For your second listen of the day, you can head on over to Locked On Sports Today, a 24-hour news show that brings you all the news you could possibly want to have access to in the sporting world. And if you're watching on YouTube, please leave us a comment what you thought about the episode, what you think about the David Jiricek trade, what you think about Matvei Michkov and Macklin Celebrini and their respective Calder races. Who would you champion in that race this season? And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Sebastian High, the USHL scout over at Elite Prospects, usually joined by Hattie Kalakesh, but who unfortunately could not make it today. But that wraps up the show. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope that you come back very, very soon.